Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back in time, way back to the bustling, muddy, and often germ-ridden streets of colonial America. Imagine yourself there, a chill wind whipping around your rough-spun cloak, the scent of wood smoke mingling with something less pleasant. You feel a tickle in your throat, a familiar cough starting to brew. In your modern world, you'd reach for a cough drop, maybe some decongestant. But in 17th century Boston or 18th century Williamsburg, oh, dear friend, your options were far more creative. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a truly bad case of the sniffles without some rather peculiar interventions. We're going to explore what our ancestors considered the ultimate cold cures, and let me tell you, some of them might make your eyebrows do a little dance of disbelief. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just arrived in the New World, let's say, sometime in the mid-17th century. The air is crisp, but also, let's be honest, often quite damp. You're living in a drafty cabin, perhaps with a family of 12, and personal hygiene isn't exactly a top priority when you're trying to clear land and avoid bears. Sickness, therefore, wasn't an if, but a when. The common cold, while seemingly minor to us, could escalate quickly into something far more severe, especially when coupled with poor nutrition, arduous labor, and a general lack of understanding about germ theory. Imagine the sheer volume of sneezing and coughing in a small, enclosed space. No hand sanitizer in sight, and the only tissue is probably the sleeve of your already grimy shirt. Good times. Colonial Americans faced a relentless barrage of ailments. Beyond the common cold, you had dysentery, influenza, measles, mumps, whooping cough, and the ever-present specter of smallpox. Life expectancy was, shall we say, a bit of a gamble. An average person might consider themselves fortunate to reach their 40s. Children were particularly vulnerable, with shockingly high mortality rates. You're not just battling a tickle in your throat, you're battling an environment that's actively trying to whittle down the population. This pervasive sense of vulnerability meant that every cough, every fever, was taken incredibly seriously, leading to a constant, desperate search for remedies. The medical landscape was a strange blend of ancient wisdom, emerging empirical observations, and a healthy dose of superstition. It wasn't uncommon for a well-meaning neighbor to offer a cure based on generations of anecdotal evidence, even if that evidence was as flimsy as a cobweb. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that the concept of germs, as we understand them, simply didn't exist. Disease was often attributed to imbalances in the body's humors, divine displeasure, or even malevolent spirits. This fundamental misunderstanding shaped every aspect of treatment. So, when you felt a cold coming on, you weren't thinking about a virus. You were thinking about what was out of whack inside your own system. Or maybe, if you were particularly unlucky, you were wondering which witch in the village had put a hex on your sinuses. A quirky tidbit, perhaps, is that some early colonial physicians believed that disease could be literally driven out of the body through intense sweating, often induced by wrapping patients in layers of blankets and placing them near roaring fires. Imagine the discomfort, the sheer oppressive heat, all in the name of purging the cold. You might drift off thinking about trying to sweat out a fever in front of a colonial fireplace, wrapped in wool, probably with a side of questionable herbal tea. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of these sweat treatments were due to actual physiological changes or simply the patient eventually getting better despite the intervention. With no concept of microscopic invaders, the dominant medical framework for centuries, even in colonial America, was the humoral theory. Imagine stepping into a doctor's, or more likely, a barber surgeon's, shop. You'd be told that your body was a delicate balance of 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humors was associated with specific qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm cold and moist, yellow bile hot and dry, and black bile cold and dry. For you, shivering with a nascent cold, The diagnosis would almost certainly point to an excess of cold and moist phlegm, possibly even a chilling of the blood. It sounds delightfully antiquated, doesn't it? Like something out of an alchemist's handbook, which, in many ways, it was. This wasn't some fringe belief. It was the bedrock of medical understanding, taught in universities across Europe and brought directly to the shores of the New World. Think about it. If you believe your body is literally too cold and too moist, what would your immediate instinct be to fix it? Well, you want to dry things out and warm things up, wouldn't you? This seemingly logical, albeit flawed, deduction led to a fascinating array of treatments. You might be prescribed warm, spicy foods to heat the body, or perhaps urged to take long, hot baths to induce sweating and expel excess moisture. Sometimes, the treatments veered into the truly bizarre, like applying warm poultices made of unlikely ingredients directly to the chest, hoping to draw out the cold humors. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky faucet by painting the wall. You're addressing a symptom, but missing the underlying issue entirely. A mainstream historical fact here is that this humoral theory originated with the ancient Greeks, most notably Hippocrates and later Galen, and its influence stretched for nearly 2 millennia. It provided a coherent, if ultimately incorrect, explanation for health and disease, guiding medical practice from the Roman Empire right up until the Enlightenment. Its persistence is a testament to how deeply ingrained certain paradigms can become. For a quirky tidbit, consider the colonial belief that certain colors of clothing could influence the balance of humors. You might be advised to wear red to stimulate blood and warmth, or perhaps avoid blue if you were feeling chilly and suffering from an excess of phlegm. So, your fashion choices weren't just about looking good. They were a vital part of your personal healthcare regimen. Imagine trying to explain that to a fashion blogger today. Sorry, can't wear pastels, my humors are all out of whack. It almost sounds like a bad excuse for not doing laundry. Historians still argue whether the consistent application of such a flawed theory sometimes yielded beneficial, albeit coincidental, results due to things like rest, hydration, or the placebo effect. Certainly, some remedies, though prescribed for the wrong reasons, might have contained compounds that offered genuine relief. For instance, a warm herbal tea, while intended to rebalance humors, might simply have soothed a sore throat and encouraged fluid intake. The sheer complexity of the human body meant that even with a fundamentally incorrect understanding, some treatments, by sheer chance, sometimes landed on something that helped. But the primary goal was always to re-establish that delicate equilibrium among the 4 humors. If you had a fever, it was too much blood or yellow bile. If you had a cold, it was too much phlegm. It was a neat, tidy system, even if it led to some rather uncomfortable and ineffective interventions. Now let's delve into the more hands-on methods of rebalancing those humors. If you were truly unlucky, or perhaps just had a doctor who was particularly enthusiastic about the latest medical trends, you might find yourself subjected to bleeding and purging. These were considered cornerstone treatments, not just for colds, but for a whole host of ailments. The logic, again, stemmed from the humoral theory. If you had too much of something, you had to get rid of it. If your cold was due to excess phlegm, well, let's just help your body along in its quest to expel it. And if you had a fever, indicating an excess of hot blood, the solution was, quite literally, to let some of it out. Imagine lying on a rough wooden table, a barber surgeon hovering over you with a gleaming, and probably not very sterile, lancet. He'd make a swift incision, perhaps in your arm, and a stream of blood would flow into a waiting basin. The amount of blood removed varied wildly, from a few ounces to, in extreme cases, what seems like a truly alarming quantity. You might feel faint, lightheaded, and generally worse than you did before the treatment. But, hey, at least your humors were being balanced. Purging, on the other hand, involved stimulating the digestive system to expel excess fluids and impurities. This could be achieved through emetics, which induced vomiting, or laxatives, which, well, you can imagine. These weren't gentle, over-the-counter remedies. We're talking about potent concoctions that could leave you feeling utterly drained and miserable. Think of it as the colonial version of a detox, only far more aggressive and less likely to be Instagrammed. A mainstream historical fact is that bleeding, also known as phlebotomy or bloodletting, was practiced for thousands of years, with evidence dating back to ancient Egypt. It was a standard treatment in Europe and the Americas, and its popularity only began to wane in the 19th century as medical understanding shifted. A quirky tidbit is that doctors often judged the quality of the blood being let, looking for changes in color and consistency to determine when the patient had been bled enough. Imagine the unsettling sight of a doctor scrutinizing your blood like a wine connoisseur, declaring it not quite right, and demanding another pint. It's enough to make your stomach churn, even centuries later. You might drift off thinking about the sheer, visceral experience of having your blood drained in the name of medical science. Historians still argue about the precise impact of bleeding and purging on patient outcomes. While these practices were undoubtedly harmful in many cases, there's a possibility that, in certain situations, they might have provided some temporary relief from symptoms, perhaps by reducing fever or pressure. However, the overall effect was likely detrimental, weakening patients and hindering their natural ability to fight off disease. It's a sobering reminder that even well-intentioned medical interventions can have disastrous consequences when based on flawed understanding. You're left to wonder how many colonists, suffering from a simple cold, were inadvertently made far worse by these drastic attempts to cure them. It's a chilling thought, especially when you consider that these were the best medical minds of the time, doing what they genuinely believed was right. Thankfully, not all colonial remedies involved the rather dramatic spectacle of bloodletting or forced expulsions. Many treatments for the common cold, and indeed a wide range of ailments, turned to the abundant pharmacy of the natural world, botanical remedies. You'd be amazed at the sheer variety of plants that were believed to hold medicinal properties, a knowledge often gleaned from indigenous populations or brought over from European traditions. Imagine yourself wandering through a colonial garden, not just for pleasure, but for survival, identifying plants by their leaves, bark, or roots, knowing that a certain herb could calm a cough, while another might ease a fever. It was a fascinating blend of practical experience and inherited folklore. Colonial households, especially those far from nascent urban centers, were often self-sufficient when it came to healthcare. The lady of the house, or perhaps an older, experienced neighbor, would be the primary caregiver, armed with a vast, often orally transmitted, knowledge of local flora. You'd learn to identify plants like sassafras, whose roots were steeped into a tea believed to purify the blood and ward off fevers. And honestly, it smells quite pleasant, like root beer. Then there was boneset, a truly bitter herb, but highly prized for its ability to induce sweating and break fevers. Imagine sipping that concoction, trying to keep a straight face as the acrid taste washed over your tongue, all in the name of feeling better. These weren't just random guesses. Many of these plants did contain compounds that had physiological effects, even if the colonists didn't understand the chemistry behind them. A mainstream historical fact is that the reliance on indigenous plants was a cornerstone of colonial medicine, and many of these remedies were learned directly from Native American communities. Settlers quickly realized that the plants they were familiar with from Europe weren't always available or effective, and indigenous knowledge filled this crucial gap. For a quirky tidbit, some remedies involved using parts of trees that were believed to have sympathetic properties. For example, bark from a weeping willow might be used for pain, long before aspirin's active ingredient, salicylic acid, was isolated from willow bark. It's almost as if nature was whispering its secrets, and the colonists were listening, even if they couldn't articulate the scientific basis. You might drift off thinking about the deep, earthy smell of a colonial herb garden, each plant a potential lifeline. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these botanical remedies was primarily due to the actual medicinal properties of the plants or a powerful placebo effect, or perhaps a combination of both. While some plants, like willow bark for pain or cinchona for malaria, clearly had potent compounds, others might have offered little more than comfort and warmth. The distinction between a genuinely effective cure and a comforting ritual was often blurred, and personal belief undoubtedly played a significant role. You can imagine a child, suffering from a cough, feeling immense relief simply from the soothing presence of their mother and the warm cup of fragrant tea she offered, regardless of its true medicinal power. It was a holistic approach, even if unintentionally so, where the act of caring was often as important as the substance of the cure. Beyond the structured knowledge of humoral theory and the practical application of botanical wisdom, colonial life was also rich with household cures and superstitions. Imagine your grandmother, or perhaps a wise elder in your small village, pulling out a dusty, leather-bound book filled with handwritten remedies passed down through generations. These weren't necessarily medical texts in the formal sense, but rather collections of folk wisdom, personal observations, and sometimes outright magical thinking. For a sniffle or a cough, you might be given something surprisingly practical, or something that makes you quietly wonder about the limits of human credulity. One common cold remedy you might encounter was a simple, yet potent, onion poultice. You'd chop up a pungent onion, heat it, and apply it directly to your chest or throat, supposedly to draw out the congestion. Imagine the strong, tear-inducing fumes wafting through your drafty bedroom. It might not have cured your cold, but it certainly would clear your sinuses, perhaps through sheer olfactory assault. Another popular, if slightly more questionable, practice involved wearing amber beads around your neck, believed to ward off disease or alleviate symptoms. You might also find yourself being given a sip of rum or brandy, perhaps with a bit of honey, not just to numb the pain of a sore throat, but as a general tonic to strengthen the body against illness. It was a fluid line between medicine and something akin to a good stiff drink. It's almost like the historical version of, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Except the medicine was sometimes just more sugar or alcohol. A mainstream historical fact is that many common household ingredients, like onions, garlic, and vinegar, were widely used in colonial medicine, often for their perceived purifying or warming properties. These were accessible and affordable, making them staples in every home's medicine cabinet. For a quirky tidbit, some colonists believed that wearing a bag of camphor around your neck could prevent illness, especially during epidemics. Imagine the distinct, almost overpowering, scent of camphor following you everywhere you went, a constant aromatic shield against unseen contagions. It's a bit like the historical equivalent of constantly spraying Lysol around yourself, but with a much more natural aroma. You might drift off thinking about the pungent smells of colonial sick rooms, a mixture of onions, alcohol, and maybe a hint of camphor. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these folk remedies was more about psychological comfort and ritual than actual physiological benefit. While some ingredients, like honey, do have soothing properties, many of the more superstitious practices likely offered little beyond a strong placebo effect and the comforting feeling that something was being done. Yet, the belief in these remedies was so strong that they persisted for generations, woven into the fabric of daily life. You can almost hear a colonial mother reassuring her child, "Just wear these beads, dear, and your cough will soon disappear." The sincerity in her voice perhaps as potent a medicine as any herb. In the challenging landscape of colonial America, where professional doctors were scarce and medical knowledge was limited, the burden of healthcare often fell squarely on the shoulders of women. Imagine the colonial wife and mother, not just tending to the hearth and home, but also acting as the primary physician, nurse, and pharmacist for her entire family and often her wider community. You'd find her constantly learning, observing, and experimenting, building a vast practical knowledge of illness and remedies. Her role was absolutely crucial, often overlooked in formal histories, but without her tireless efforts, colonial survival rates would have been even grimmer. These women were often called she-physicians, healing women, or simply wise women. They were the first responders to every cough, fever, broken bone, and childbirth. Their expertise wasn't gained in medical schools, which barely existed even for men, but through apprenticeship, inherited wisdom, and sheer necessity. You'd see them meticulously tending to herb gardens, knowing exactly which plant to gather for a child's croup, or how to prepare a soothing poultice for a feverish spouse. They understood the seasonal shifts in health, the importance of diet, and the subtle signs of various ailments. This wasn't just about mixing a few teas. It was about managing a household's health from cradle to grave, often under incredibly difficult circumstances. They had to be resourceful, pragmatic, and incredibly resilient. A mainstream historical fact is that in many colonial communities, women were the primary practitioners of medicine, especially in rural areas where access to male physicians was non-existent. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and practical nursing skills was essential for public health. For a quirky tidbit, some women kept receipt books, essentially personal journals filled with handwritten recipes for everything from baking bread to curing scrofula. These books were precious family heirlooms, passed down through generations, brimming with insights into colonial life and medicine. Imagine flipping through one of these ancient tomes, finding a recipe for cough syrup that involved boiled roots and honey, right next to instructions for pickling cucumbers. You might drift off thinking about the quiet, determined strength of these colonial women who held their families' lives in their capable hands. Historians still argue about the extent to which these female healers integrated indigenous medical practices into their own European traditions. While there's clear evidence of knowledge exchange, the precise mechanisms and the degree of adoption remain a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. What is clear, however, is that these women were innovators in their own right, constantly adapting and synthesizing knowledge from various sources to meet the desperate medical needs of their communities. Their work laid an informal but vital foundation for healthcare in the colonies, demonstrating that the best doctors weren't always the ones with formal titles, but often the ones who simply showed up, day after day, with practical knowledge and immense compassion. While the common cold was a nuisance, colonial life presented far more terrifying health challenges. One of the most prevalent and deadly was malaria and other fevers. Imagine living in a swampy settlement, the air thick with mosquitoes, and suddenly, a wave of shivering, burning fever washes over you. This wasn't just a bad flu. These fevers could quickly become fatal, especially for those already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases. The prevailing humoral theory struggled to fully account for these recurring, often geographically specific, outbreaks, leading to a desperate search for effective remedies. The initial approach to fevers, as you might recall from our earlier discussion, often involved bleeding and purging to cool the body and expel hot humors. But for persistent fevers like malaria, which often presented with cyclical chills and sweats, these methods often proved ineffective, or worse, debilitating. The colonists, particularly in the southern colonies where malaria was endemic, faced a constant battle against this unseen enemy. You might hear whispers of a mysterious ague that swept through settlements, leaving behind a trail of weakened, shivering survivors, or worse, empty chairs at the dinner table. It was a terrifying reality that forced them to seek out new, often indigenous, solutions. A mainstream historical fact of immense importance is the introduction and adoption of cinchona bark, the source of quinine. This bark, originally from South America and known to indigenous peoples for centuries, was a true game-changer. European traders brought it back, and eventually it made its way to the colonies. Imagine the relief as colonists discovered that a decoction made from this bitter bark could actually break the cycle of malarial fevers. It was one of the first truly effective remedies for a major infectious disease, even though its mechanism wasn't understood. For a quirky tidbit, cinchona bark was sometimes called Jesuits' bark, because Jesuit missionaries were instrumental in bringing its medicinal properties to Europe. Imagine a colonial doctor explaining this wonder cure, perhaps still skeptical of its origins, but undeniably impressed by its results. You might drift off thinking about the subtle, bitter taste of cinchona tea, a taste that represented hope in a time of widespread despair. Historians still argue about the speed and widespread adoption of cinchona bark in all colonial regions. While its effectiveness against malaria was undeniable, its availability and cost varied, and older, less effective remedies often persisted alongside it. The logistical challenges of importing and distributing a relatively rare botanical meant that it wasn't a universal panacea. You can almost hear the discussions around the colonial fireplace, debating whether to trust the familiar but often failing local herbs, or to spend precious coin on this exotic, foreign bark that promised a cure. It was a complex decision, balancing tradition, cost, and desperation in the face of relentless illness. As the colonies grew, so did the challenges of public health, leading to a crucial and often controversial development: smallpox inoculation. Imagine living in a world where a disease like smallpox could sweep through a town, leaving behind a trail of death, disfigurement, and terror. Unlike a cold or even malaria, smallpox had a horrifying visibility, scarring survivors for life. The very word smallpox sent shivers down spines, a grim reaper stalking every family. When a new method emerged that promised protection, even if it seemed counterintuitive, it sparked intense debate and even riots. The standard response to smallpox was often isolation and prayer. But in the early 18th century, a revolutionary, yet terrifying, idea began to spread: variolation. This was not vaccination as we know it, but a primitive form of inoculation where material from a smallpox lesion of an infected person was deliberately introduced into a healthy individual, often through a scratch on the skin. The goal was to induce a mild case of the disease, thereby granting immunity. Imagine the bravery, or perhaps desperation, it would take to willingly introduce the very disease you feared into your own body, or worse, into your child's. You'd be told it was safer than catching the full-blown disease, but the idea of making yourself sick to get well must have felt profoundly unsettling. A mainstream historical fact is that variolation was introduced to the American colonies by Cotton Mather, a prominent Puritan minister, and Dr. Zabdiel Boylston in Boston in 1721 during a severe smallpox epidemic. Mather had learned about the practice from his enslaved African servant, one Zymus, who described the traditional African method of inducing mild smallpox to prevent severe cases. This is a fascinating intersection of knowledge transfer across cultures, often overlooked. For a quirky tidbit, the early inoculations often involved a period of intense isolation for the inoculated individual, usually for several weeks, to prevent them from spreading the induced, albeit mild, smallpox to others. Imagine being confined to a small, quarantined house for weeks, deliberately unwell, hoping you'd survive this self-inflicted ordeal. You might drift off thinking about the courage or sheer terror of those who underwent variolation, gambling with their lives for a chance at immunity. Historians still argue about the ethical implications and the public perception of variolation, particularly given the risks involved. While it was demonstrably safer than natural smallpox, there was still a mortality rate associated with the procedure itself, and those who survived the induced illness could still transmit the disease. This led to fierce opposition from some members of the public and even some physicians, who saw it as unnatural or dangerous. The debate was intense, reflecting the deep-seated anxieties about medical intervention and the limits of human control over disease. It's a stark reminder that even life-saving innovations often face significant resistance, especially when they challenge deeply held beliefs or involve perceived risks. Shifting from life-threatening epidemics to a more mundane, yet persistently uncomfortable aspect of colonial health, let's consider dentistry and oral health. Imagine yourself in colonial America, perhaps chewing on a tough piece of dried meat, and suddenly, a sharp pain shoots through your jaw. Toothache. For us, it's an annoying trip to the dentist. For them, it was a terrifying ordeal, often leading to extraction with rudimentary tools and no pain relief beyond a swig of rum or a prayer. The state of oral hygiene was, shall we say, a bit less than sparkling. Tooth decay was rampant, a consequence of diets often high in carbohydrates and lacking in consistent oral hygiene practices. You might try to clean your teeth with a rough cloth and some charcoal, but daily brushing, as we know it, was not common. When a toothache struck, it wasn't just discomfort. It could lead to serious infections, affecting your ability to eat, speak, and even threatening your life. The dentist was often the local barber surgeon, or perhaps a blacksmith, equipped with a fearsome pair of forceps. Imagine the scene. You, strapped down, the smell of spirits in the air, and the looming shadow of a hefty tool designed more for pulling nails than delicate extractions. It's enough to make you wince even now. A mainstream historical fact is that dental care in the colonies was largely reactive and focused on extraction rather than preservation. Fillings and complex restorative procedures were almost unheard of, and false teeth, when they existed, were often crudely made from animal bone or human teeth. For a quirky tidbit, some colonial folk remedies for toothache involved rubbing the aching tooth with a piece of a freshly killed mole, or even reciting charms. Imagine trying to explain that to your modern dentist. They might suggest you need more than just a filling. You might drift off thinking about the surprisingly robust, yet often painful, teeth of colonial ancestors. Historians still argue about the prevalence of dental hygiene practices beyond simple rinsing. While some wealthier individuals might have possessed early toothbrushes or toothpicks, the vast majority of the population likely relied on more casual methods, leading to widespread decay. The impact of chronic oral infections on overall health, though difficult to quantify precisely, was undoubtedly significant, contributing to a lower quality of life and potentially exacerbating other ailments. It's a testament to the sheer resilience of colonial folk that they managed to eat and thrive with what must have been persistently painful mouths. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of colonial life was the grim reality of childhood illnesses and mortality. Imagine the tender age of childhood in the colonies, a time not just of play and learning, but of constant vulnerability. You'd see families with many children, yet only a handful might survive to adulthood. Diseases that we now consider mild, like measles or whooping cough, were often death sentences for colonial infants and toddlers. The common cold, as innocuous as it sounds today, could easily spiral into pneumonia, especially in poorly heated homes. Life for a colonial child began with considerable risk. Childbirth itself was fraught with danger for both mother and infant, and if you survived that, a new gauntlet of unseen enemies awaited. Measles, mumps, chickenpox, and scarlet fever swept through communities with terrifying regularity. Without modern vaccines or antibiotics, the only defense was often the child's own nascent immune system, aided by whatever rudimentary care their parents could provide. You might witness a mother desperately trying to cool a feverish child with cold compresses, or administer a homemade cough syrup, all while knowing that her efforts might ultimately be futile. The concept of herd immunity was, of course, utterly unknown, meaning that new infections could spread like wildfire through susceptible populations. A mainstream historical fact here is that infant and child mortality rates in colonial America were extraordinarily high, often exceeding 20 to 30% before the age of 5. This meant that the loss of a child was a tragically common experience for colonial families. For a quirky tidbit, some parents would tie specific objects around their children's necks, like a necklace of beads or a bag of herbs, believing it would ward off illness or protect them from the evil eye. Imagine the child, perhaps already coughing, wearing a tiny, talismanic charm, a silent plea for protection against unseen dangers. You might drift off thinking about the quiet, pervasive grief that must have shadowed so many colonial households, a constant reminder of life's fragility. Historians still argue about the precise impact of specific environmental factors, such as sanitation and diet, on colonial child health compared to the sheer force of infectious diseases. While hygiene was certainly rudimentary by modern standards, the overwhelming power of pathogens like smallpox, diphtheria, and measles often overshadowed other contributing factors. It's a somber reflection on an era where the innocence of childhood was constantly under siege, and the love of parents, however strong, often met with overwhelming medical limitations. Stepping inside the colonial version of a pharmacy, you'd find yourself in the apothecary's arsenal. Imagine a small, dimly lit shop, filled with the pungent aromas of dried herbs, exotic spices, and perhaps the faint, metallic scent of chemicals. This wasn't your brightly lit, sterile modern drugstore. It was a treasure trove of remedies, often chaotic in its organization, and overseen by a figure who was part chemist, part botanist, and part entrepreneur. For a common cold, an apothecary might offer you a seemingly endless array of concoctions, each promising relief. The apothecary's shelves would be lined with jars of powders, bottles of tinctures, and bundles of dried plants. You might find familiar European herbs alongside exotic imports like rhubarb, used as a purgative, or ipecac, an emetic. They'd mix compounds on demand, grinding ingredients with a mortar and pestle, or distilling liquids in a still. Imagine the meticulous process of measuring out minute quantities of a potent substance, hoping to get the dosage just right. It was a delicate balance between efficacy and danger, given the limited understanding of pharmacology. A quick look around might reveal curious tools, like scales for weighing tiny amounts of silver or mercury, both sometimes used in remedies, though certainly not for a mere cold. A mainstream historical fact is that apothecaries played a crucial role in colonial healthcare, serving as primary providers of medicines and often offering medical advice, especially in larger towns. They were the bridge between imported medical knowledge and the immediate needs of the community. For a quirky tidbit, some apothecaries were also involved in the sale of secret remedies or patent medicines, proprietary concoctions with often dubious claims and ingredients, but immensely popular among the public. Imagine being sold a bottle of Dr. Johnson's miraculous cold elixir, with a label boasting fantastical cures, even if it was mostly alcohol and a few herbs. You might drift off thinking about the dusty bottles and intriguing labels in a colonial apothecary shop, each one holding a promise, or perhaps just a potent liquid. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of many of the compounds found in an apothecary shop. While some, like opium for pain relief, were undeniably potent, others were likely ineffective, and some, like mercury-based treatments, were actively harmful. The lack of standardized dosages and quality control meant that even effective remedies could be dangerous if improperly prepared or administered. It's a testament to the sheer experimentation of the era, where every new substance was a potential cure, and every patient a willing or unwilling participant in an ongoing medical trial. While apothecaries dealt with the concoctions, there were times when illness demanded a more drastic intervention, surgical procedures, and their limitations. Imagine a colonial patient, perhaps suffering from an abscessed tooth we just discussed, or a deep wound from a logging accident. For a common cold, surgery was, thankfully, never an option. But for more severe ailments, it was a terrifying last resort, performed without anesthetics as we know them, and with only the barest understanding of hygiene. The colonial surgeon, often also a barber, was not a refined, sterile figure. His tools would be simple: saws, scalpels, forceps, all likely wiped clean, but certainly not sterilized in a modern sense. You might be given a shot of rum or a hard bite on a leather strap to dull the excruciating pain. Imagine the sheer agony of a limb amputation or the draining of a deep infection, all while you were fully conscious. There was no going under, beyond perhaps passing out from the shock. The process was often swift out of necessity, a gruesome race against time to complete the procedure before the patient succumbed to shock or pain. The success rate was, predictably, low, with infection being an ever-present, silent killer after the initial trauma. A mainstream historical fact is that colonial surgery was primarily focused on addressing immediate, life-threatening injuries or conditions, such as setting broken bones, amputating gangrenous limbs, or removing visible tumors. It was a brutal but often necessary field given the circumstances. For a quirky tidbit, early surgeons sometimes used heated irons to cauterize wounds after an amputation, hoping to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Imagine the sizzle and smell, a chilling sensory detail in a world already full of discomfort. You might drift off thinking about the immense pain and fear of colonial patients facing the surgeon's knife. Historians still argue about the true impact of surgical innovations, such as they were, on overall colonial mortality rates. While some immediate lives were undoubtedly saved by quick amputations or draining of dangerous abscesses, the subsequent high rates of infection meant that survival was far from guaranteed. The development of antiseptic techniques and anesthesia lay centuries in the future, leaving colonial surgery as a stark and often fatal gamble. It's a powerful reminder of how far medical science has advanced and how much suffering our ancestors endured without the comfort of modern interventions. Beyond the physical afflictions of the body, colonial America also grappled with conditions we would now recognize as affecting mental health and melancholy. Imagine a colonist, perhaps isolated on a remote farm or struggling with the relentless hardships of frontier life, succumbing to a profound sadness that lasts for months. You might call it melancholy, a term that encompassed a wide range of psychological distress, from deep sadness to what we might now identify as clinical depression or anxiety. It was an era where the inner workings of the mind were poorly understood, often attributed to spiritual failings or an imbalance of those familiar humors. For someone experiencing melancholy, the treatments were a strange mix of the physical and the spiritual. You might be prescribed herbal sedatives, like valerian, to calm the nerves, or given emetics to purge the black bile, which was thought to cause melancholic states. Sometimes, the advice was more spiritual: increased prayer, reflection, or even attending more church services. Imagine a minister suggesting that your persistent sadness was due to a lack of faith, adding a layer of guilt to an already overwhelming burden. There were no therapists, no antidepressants, and certainly no understanding of neurochemistry. Social support often came from family and community, but professional help was practically non-existent. A mainstream historical fact is that mental illness was often viewed through a moral or religious lens, with melancholy sometimes seen as a spiritual weakness or a sign of divine displeasure. This often led to isolation rather than effective treatment. For a quirky tidbit, some remedies involved a change of scenery, prescribing travel, or engaging in stimulating activities like reading or gardening to lift the spirits. Imagine a colonial doctor suggesting a leisurely trip to Philadelphia to cure your blues, perhaps not realizing the patient barely had enough money for bread. You might drift off thinking about the quiet struggles of colonial minds, unseen and often untreated. Historians still argue about the social stigma attached to mental health issues in colonial society. While some individuals might have received compassionate care from their families, others might have been ostracized or misunderstood, their suffering amplified by a lack of societal understanding and appropriate medical frameworks. The prevailing view was that the mind was secondary to the body, and its ailments were less tangible, less real, than a broken leg or a raging fever, making the path to recovery even more difficult. Crucially, when European settlers arrived in the Americas, they encountered a vast existing body of knowledge regarding health and healing. Indigenous healing influences. Imagine a weary European settler, perhaps afflicted by a new disease unknown in their homeland, turning to a Native American healer whose profound understanding of local flora and traditional practices offered a chance at recovery. You'd observe a stark contrast in medical philosophies, with indigenous approaches often emphasizing holistic well-being, spiritual harmony, and deep ecological knowledge. Native American tribes possessed sophisticated medical systems developed over thousands of years, encompassing an intricate understanding of plants, animal products, and spiritual practices. Their healers, often called shamans or medicine people, used a wide array of botanical remedies, many of which were entirely new to the European newcomers. Imagine being introduced to the potent fever-reducing properties of cinchona bark or the antiseptic qualities of certain tree resins, long before European science caught up. These healers also practiced various forms of spiritual healing, recognizing the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit in a way that humoral theory rarely did. The exchange of knowledge, though often uneven and sometimes exploitative, was undeniably vital for colonial survival. A mainstream historical fact is that many effective botanical remedies used by colonists, including those for malaria and various fevers, were learned directly from Native American communities. Without this knowledge transfer, colonial mortality rates would have been even higher. For a quirky tidbit, some Native American healing rituals involved elaborate ceremonies, drumming, and chanting, designed to restore balance and drive out illness. Imagine witnessing such a ceremony, a powerful and unfamiliar blend of the sacred and the medicinal, profoundly different from any European practice. You might drift off thinking about the deep wisdom held by indigenous healers and the profound impact their knowledge had on the survival of the early colonies. Historians still argue about the extent to which European medical practices genuinely integrated indigenous knowledge versus simply appropriating it for their own use, without proper acknowledgement or respect. While the practical benefits were clear, the cultural implications of this exchange remain complex and often fraught with historical injustices. Nevertheless, the influence of Native American healing traditions is an undeniable and often underappreciated chapter in the story of colonial American medicine. Finally, let's consider the legacy of colonial medicine. Imagine looking back from our modern vantage point, equipped with antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced diagnostics, at the crude, often painful, and frequently ineffective practices of colonial America. You'd undoubtedly feel a sense of relief for the progress made, but also a quiet appreciation for the sheer resilience and ingenuity of those who came before us. The common cold, once a potentially serious threat, is now a minor inconvenience, a testament to centuries of trial, error, and scientific breakthroughs. The colonial period, for all its medical shortcomings, laid some foundational groundwork. It highlighted the critical importance of hygiene, even if poorly understood, the power of observation, and the relentless human drive to alleviate suffering. The transition from humoral theory to a more empirical, evidence-based approach was gradual, but the seeds were sown in these early, often desperate, attempts to understand and combat disease. You can trace a direct line from the apothecary's careful mixing of herbs to the modern pharmaceutical lab, or from the early, terrifying smallpox inoculations to today's sophisticated vaccine programs. It was a messy, imperfect journey, but it was a journey forward nonetheless. A mainstream historical fact is that while colonial medicine was largely based on outdated theories, the sheer volume of practical experience gained by trial and error, particularly with botanical remedies, gradually contributed to a more empirical understanding of disease and treatment. For a quirky tidbit, some colonial medical textbooks contain detailed diagrams of medicinal plants, looking almost like botanical art, reflecting the intense study of nature that underpinned much of their practice. Imagine leafing through such a book, seeing the delicate drawings of herbs that were once a family's only hope against illness. You might drift off thinking about the echoes of those early medical struggles, still reverberating in the quiet hum of a modern hospital. Historians still argue about the precise turning points that led to the decline of humoral theory and the rise of modern scientific medicine. Was it the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the advent of microscopy, or the sheer volume of empirical data that slowly chipped away at old beliefs? It was likely a confluence of factors, a slow, generational shift in understanding that transformed medicine from a realm of speculation to one of rigorous scientific inquiry. We can be grateful for the progress, while quietly honoring the brave, if sometimes misguided, efforts of those who battled illness with the limited tools they possessed. As the echoes of their struggles begin to fade, allow your own thoughts to soften. The rough textures of homespun linen, the distant whispers of a child's cough, the scent of wood smoke and bitter herbs. Let these images drift away. Feel the gentle weight of your blankets, the steady rhythm of your breath. The battles against invisible foes are long over for them, and for you, only peaceful quiet remains. Your own worries can gently settle, just like the evening light outside. Allow your mind to drift, to unfurl, feeling the soft embrace of calm. Every thought can become a cloud, floating slowly away into the vast, calm sky of your mind. You are safe. You are warm. You are ready for rest.